Section 1. The pilot that almost never existed. There is a version of Family Guy that you have never seen. A rougher, stranger, more unpolished version where Lois Griffin has blonde hair, where Seth MacFarlane is doing Chris Griffin's voice himself in a very different register than Seth Green would later bring to the role, where the animation moves in ways that feel simultaneously more alive and less refined than anything that ever made it onto television. It is a version where some of the jokes land differently, where the pacing breathes in unexpected directions, and where you can feel the hands of one exhausted young animator drawing frantically in a kitchen apartment late into the night, trying to convince a television network that the world he had built in his head deserved to exist. That version was the pitch pilot. 15 minutes of hand-drawn animation built on a budget of $50,000, put together by a 24-year-old who had graduated from the Rhode Island School of Design and spent his early professional years working in the writers' rooms and animation departments of Cartoon Network shows like Johnny, Bravo, Cow and Chicken, and Dexter's Laboratory. His name was Seth MacFarlane, and he had been carrying these characters around in his imagination for years before Fox gave him the chance to put them on paper. The story of how that pitch pilot came to exist stretches back to 1995, when MacFarlane was still a student at RISD. His thesis film was a short called The Life of Larry, which featured a round, good-natured, not particularly clever man named Larry and his dog Steve. If you watch that short today, the genetic link between those two characters and Peter Griffin and Brian Griffin is immediately visible in the way you recognize a parent in a child's face. Larry became Peter. Steve became Brian. The family grew up around them. The whole mythology of what would become one of the most watched animated shows in television history was assembled piece by piece in a student film that most of the world would never see. A follow-up short called Larry and Steve appeared in 1997 as part of Cartoon Network's world premiere Toons anthology. That one got noticed. Fox reached out to MacFarlane, expressed interest in developing a series, and gave him the green light and the money to put together the pitch. MacFarlane has talked in interviews about those 6 months of production in terms that make it sound like a fever dream of labor. No sleep, no social life, just drawing, just working, just building this thing from scratch in a way that gave him total creative control but also put every single decision on his shoulders alone. The result was a pilot that told essentially the same story as the broadcast version of the first episode, Death Has a Shadow, but with notable differences that reveal a great deal about how the show's identity was still being figured out. In the pitch version, Lois is blonde rather than auburn-haired. Stewie wears a purple variation of his familiar red outfit along with green overalls. Meg is in a white shirt with blue lining and a blue beanie, rather than the pink hat and clothes that became her signature look. Chris wears shorts and no shoes. The animation itself was done mostly in-house rather than farmed out to overseas studios, and it carries that unmistakable quality of work done by people who are close to the material, loose and energetic but unpolished in the way that early things often are. Some of the character dynamics were also different in ways that are interesting to consider. In the pitch pilot, when Peter loses his job and needs to figure out what to do, it is Chris who convinces him to sign up for welfare rather than Brian. Brian, who would become the moral compass and voice of reason in the early seasons of the broadcast show, plays a less central role in the earlier version. The relationship between Peter and Brian that would end up being one of the foundational elements of the whole series was still being established, still being understood by the man creating it. And then there is the voice casting. MacFarlane obviously voices Peter and Brian and Stewie, but in the pitch pilot he also voices Chris Griffin, speaking in a register that is distinctly different from the one Seth Green would eventually make famous. Meg, meanwhile, was originally voiced in the pitch by Rachel MacFarlane, Seth's sister, rather than by Lacey Chabert, who would take the role for the broadcast first season before Mila Kunis came in for season 2, and has held it ever since. Even Butch Hartman, the creator of Fairly Odd Parents, provided some voices in the pitch pilot for minor characters including Mr. Weed and a few background figures. For a long time, the full pitch pilot existed in something close to the category of lost media. A 7-minute excerpt had been included as a bonus feature on the Family Guy Volume 2 DVD release, and those 7 minutes circulated online among fans who treasured them. But the complete 16-plus minute version was effectively gone from public view for over 2 decades, sitting somewhere in a private archive without broad access. Then in March 2025, an animator named Robert Paulson, who had been credited on the original pilot for work on compositing and digital ink and paint, had the complete version sitting on his personal website. The internet found it. It spread. And suddenly, people who had been fans of Family Guy for 20 years were watching the thing that started everything in its full and unedited form for the very first time. The reactions were exactly what you would expect from people seeing a raw and early version of something they love. Comments comparing it to how South Park characters look when someone draws them from memory. Observations that the lip syncing is off in certain places because the audio track was still being finalized. Appreciation for the moments where you can see the eventual shape of the show clearly through the rougher surface of the work. And underneath all of that, a kind of quiet reverence for the fact that this scrappy, imperfect, deeply personal thing was the seed from which something enormous grew. The broadcast version of the pilot, which aired on the 31st of January 1999, right after Super Bowl 33, pulled in around 22 million viewers. That number would never be equaled by the show again. It was the television equivalent of a perfect opening night, the kind of performance that sets expectations that cannot possibly be sustained. But in that moment, it meant that whatever Seth MacFarlane had built in his kitchen during those 6 sleepless months had worked. The characters that started as a student thesis had become something that 22 million people wanted to spend time with on one of the biggest broadcast nights of the year. The broadcast pilot also had content that most people have never heard in its original form. In a cutaway where Peter loses a music competition to the Von Trapp family, the words spoken by Peter after his defeat was, in the original unedited version, something the network would not allow on air. The profanity was literally drowned out by the sounds of applause in the final broadcast cut, and the writers deliberately constructed it that way to slip a lower content rating past the censors while still technically including the moment they wanted. The same episode has Lois saying something explicit that was similarly buried under the audio mix. These were the earliest examples of a practice that would define the show for years, the business of saying things on screen that you could technically deny having said. What the pilot represented, beyond the immediate numbers and the industry attention, was a very particular kind of creative achievement. A young person with a specific vision had drawn his way into one of the most competitive spaces in entertainment and made something that felt genuinely new. Family Guy in its earliest form was not trying to be The Simpsons. It was not trying to be anything that already existed. It was doing something with narrative structure and comedic timing and character relationships that had not quite been done before, and it announced itself to the world with a self-assurance that only comes from someone who has been living with an idea long enough that they trust it completely. So wherever you are right now, listening to this, know that everything we are going to explore tonight started with a 24-year-old drawing alone in his kitchen. $50,000, 6 months. A pilot that almost no one was supposed to see in its original form, and a broadcast debut that 22 million people watched. Drop a comment right now and tell me where you are and what time it is. Seriously, I love seeing the range of people who watch these, from time zones all over the world, people falling asleep to this at 2 a.m. or winding down on a Sunday afternoon. Let me know. And if you have not subscribed yet, please do that now. It is the single best thing you can do to help the channel, and it takes about 2 seconds. Section 2. The moments cut from the broadcast, the first edits, and the things that changed. Once a show is on the air, there is a machinery that activates around it. Standards departments, network notes, advertising considerations, legal review. The creative process that feels so free in development suddenly has walls around it, and every episode that gets made becomes a negotiation between what the people making the show want to put into it and what the various layers of institutional oversight are willing to allow. For Family Guy, that negotiation was contentious from the very beginning, and the history of what got cut, what got altered, and what got quietly buried is in many ways more interesting than the history of what made it through. The pilot episode itself carries the earliest known example of material being deliberately obscured in the audio mix. That Von Trapp competition cutaway, mentioned in the previous section, was not just a matter of the network asking for a word to be removed and the writers obliging. The writers constructed the audio environment of the scene so that the word they wanted to say was technically present in the recording, but functionally inaudible under the crowd noise. The uncensored audio track, which surfaced years later on a special edition DVD collection called the Freakin' Sweet Collection, confirms what the writers always maintained, that the word is there. It was never removed. It was hidden. And hiding something inside a piece of audio that sounds like something else is a very different act from censorship. It is a form of authorial mischief, a way of keeping the original intent of the joke alive inside the broadcast version for anyone who knew to listen for it. That instinct, to preserve something in a form that looks compliant but contains the original version underneath, would become a recurring theme in the show's relationship with its own content. The DVD releases, beginning with the first volume and continuing through the various special collections, became the archival home for the things that television would not allow. Director's cuts, extended scenes, lines of dialogue that were present in the table read and the recording but removed before broadcast. The show had two versions of itself almost from the start, the network version and the real version, and fans who cared about the difference learned very quickly which format gave them access to which. In that same first episode, Peter throws the oversized stone statue of David's private parts into a neighbor's yard. In the pitch pilot, the neighbor is a prototype version of Quagmire. In the broadcast pilot, it lands on Mr. Weed's property. That change was not a content concern. It was a story logic adjustment, but it illustrates how much the details were still being worked out even between the pitch and the broadcast version, and it serves as a reminder that the show's characters and their spatial relationships in the fictional town were not locked in immediately. They were arrived at gradually, through iteration. The early seasons also contained several moments that were handled differently in syndication versus original broadcast. A scene from the 5th episode of the first season features a joke built around the assassinations of both John and Robert Kennedy, using a Pez dispenser as the visual vehicle for the gag. The dispenser, shaped like John Kennedy's head, is destroyed by a stray bullet, and the child holding it immediately produces a Bobby Kennedy dispenser in the same situation. It is the kind of dark joke that the early show did with precision, finding a way to make something extremely uncomfortable into something surprisingly funny through the sheer audacity of the construction. But that scene was cut from the American DVD release and removed from most subsequent television broadcasts. MacFarlane himself said in a 2012 interview with Entertainment Weekly that he regrets making that joke, which makes it one of the rare instances where the creator's own retrospective discomfort became part of the reason something disappeared. Then there is the episode PTV from Season 4, which was written specifically as a satirical response to the wave of broadcast censorship that swept through American television following the 2004 Super Bowl halftime performance that involved Janet Jackson and Justin Timberlake. The irony is almost too perfect. An episode made to mock censorship was itself censored. The DVD version of PTV contains a scene where Peter starts what amounts to a dangerous stunt series, and the extended sequence involving a highway overpass and a very young Stewie was deemed too extreme for the original broadcast, so the writers simply removed the entire scene rather than alter it. It is one of the cleaner examples of the show's creative team using excision as a form of protest, taking the material out of the broadcast but preserving it for the format where they retained more control. The Conway Twitty sequences, which became a running feature of the show for a period, represent a completely different kind of unusual content decision. These were moments where, instead of an animated cutaway joke, the show would cut to what appeared to be archival footage of the country singer Conway Twitty performing one of his songs. The performance would continue for an extended duration, sometimes past the 1-minute mark, with no comedic overlay, no joke at the end, and no narrative purpose in relation to the episode's story. The first time it happened, audiences were genuinely uncertain whether they were watching something intentional. The writers have been somewhat evasive over the years about what exactly the Conway Twitty sequences were meant to accomplish, beyond the meta joke of simply refusing to do a joke in a space where a joke was expected. Whether that constitutes creative boldness or creative laziness depends entirely on your tolerance for that kind of anti-comedy. But what is unquestionable is that these segments were unusual enough that some broadcast runs of certain episodes shortened them, and that the full versions exist only in specific home video releases. The show also had a complicated relationship with content involving real people. Early episodes included celebrity impressions and guest appearances from actual public figures, and the rules around what you could do with someone's likeness in an animated context were considerably less codified in 1999 than they would later become. Some of this content aged gracefully and some did not, and the ones that did not have quietly disappeared from certain streaming versions of the show without formal announcement or acknowledgement. If you compare the episode list on one streaming service to the same show on another, you will occasionally find runtime discrepancies that suggest trimming happened, though the specifics are not always publicly documented. There is also the matter of the show's relationship with the Parents Television Council, a watchdog organization that placed Family Guy on their annual worst programs list multiple times during the early seasons, including 2000, 2005, and 2006. The Federal Communications Commission received formal complaints about specific episodes, and there were organized petition efforts to have the show removed from broadcast. None of this succeeded, but the volume of institutional pressure directed at the show during its first decade is a historical record of just how far outside the mainstream the show was operating in terms of content, and it provides context for why the decision to cut, alter, or bury certain moments was not always about the network's own comfort, but about managing a regulatory and advertiser environment that was genuinely hostile. What you are left with when you look at all of this together is a show that from its very first episode understood itself to be in a permanent negotiation with the forces that wanted it to be different. And the writers' response to that negotiation was never to fully capitulate. They found the edge of what was allowable, and they put the material right there, and then they put the uncensored version somewhere else for the people who wanted it. The result is a show with two archives, the official one and the real one, and the gap between them tells you something important about the people who made it. Section 3. The Voice in the Booth. What happened before the characters became themselves? Seth MacFarlane has talked at various points in interviews about the moment when Peter Griffin's voice first fully arrived. He was a student at RISD, walking across campus one day, and he overheard a security guard having a conversation. Something about the way the man spoke, the cadence of it, the working-class Rhode Island weight in the vowels, the slightly inflated confidence in the delivery, clicked into place in MacFarlane's imagination as the voice of the character he had been developing. He went home and he could do it. Not a perfect imitation of the security guard, but a version filtered through the character's specific personality, a sound that belonged to Peter Griffin and only to Peter Griffin. That is how some voices get found. They arrive fully formed because they have been building up for years in someone's ear without that person necessarily knowing it. Others are arrived at through a more laborious process of elimination, of trying different things and discarding them until something sticks. Brian Griffin's voice, which MacFarlane also performs, came from a more deliberate place. MacFarlane conceived Brian as the intellectual counterbalance to Peter's chaos, the character who would anchor the show in something resembling reason. The voice needed to communicate intelligence and a certain kind of dry, slightly deflated sophistication without tipping over into parody. What MacFarlane landed on was a register that felt genuinely educated without being performed, a voice that sounds like someone who has read many books and perhaps wishes he had read more, and who carries that quiet ache of unrealized ambition in the way he chooses his words. Stewie Griffin was different again. The character was conceived as a villain in the body of an infant, and the voice needed to carry genuine menace alongside the comedy of the physical absurdity. MacFarlane has described the influence of Rex Harrison's speaking style from My Fair Lady as part of the DNA of Stewie's voice, that clipped, confident, mid-Atlantic diction that sounds simultaneously educated and imperious. The key to making Stewie work was making his voice unironic in its delivery. He does not sound like someone doing a funny baby voice. He sounds like a person who happens to be in a baby's body, and that literalness is what gives every line he delivers its specific texture. Now the casting story for the other major characters is equally interesting, and in some cases considerably more complicated. Alex Borstein, who voices Lois, was working on the sketch comedy show Mad TV when the Family Guy pilot was being assembled. The connection between the two projects happened through a producer named Leslie Collins Small, who was simultaneously involved in developing both shows. At an early stage, the thinking was that Family Guy might actually function as short interstitial segments between Mad TV sketches rather than as a standalone series. That version never materialized, but it illustrates how fluid the concept still was in those very early months. Borstein went into a recording booth, having never met MacFarlane and having seen none of the artwork, and she started doing a voice she had been developing for a stage show she performed in, a voice based on a cousin of hers from Long Island that she had been using for a redheaded mother character. MacFarlane's initial direction on the voice was not to slow it down or speed it up, but to make it, in his words, less annoying, and then to speed it up because at its original pace, the whole show would have run significantly over its allotted time. But here is the part that is less well known. When the show moved from pilot to full series production, Fox's network executives decided they wanted to replace Borstein. They did not think she was right for the role. She was told this and was asked to re-audition in an open casting call that the network also extended to essentially any actress in Los Angeles who wanted to come in and read for Lois Griffin. Borstein has talked about this experience publicly, including at the show's panel at the 2006 Paley Festival, describing it as something she fought for. She re-auditioned. She competed. She kept the role. But the very nearly happened version of Family Guy where Lois Griffin sounds completely different is a real version of events that came within an executive decision of becoming reality. The original voice of Meg Griffin is a similarly layered story. For the pitch pilot, the role was given to Cree Summer, who was well known for her voice work in animated series including Tiny Toon Adventures and many others. Summer was then let go by the time the show went to series, and the role went to Lacey Chabert, who was simultaneously doing Party of Five and would eventually appear in Mean Girls. Chabert voiced Meg through the entire first season before departing the role. She has said in interviews that she left of her own accord due to the demands of her other commitments, while MacFarlane described it as primarily a contractual matter. Either way, after season 1, the search for a new Meg Griffin was on. Mila Kunis was 15 years old when she auditioned for the role. She was already doing that 70s show at the time, and she came in and read for the part using essentially her own voice rather than a constructed character voice. MacFarlane's only note to her in the audition was to slow down. She was talking quickly, as teenagers do when they are nervous, and the performance needed to breathe a little more. She got the job. She has been Meg Griffin ever since, which means she has spent more than half of her life giving voice to a character who, for a significant stretch of the show's run, was treated with extraordinary cruelty by both the other characters and the writers themselves. She has talked about this in ways that reveal a genuine affection for Meg that coexists with a clear awareness of what happened to the character over the years. Seth Green, who voices Chris Griffin, came into his audition doing something very specific. He was doing an impression of Buffalo Bill, the antagonist from The Silence of the Lambs, filtered through the experience of hearing that character speak over a public address system in a fast food restaurant. The logic of it, a disturbing thriller villain's voice distorted through institutional audio equipment, is completely absurd, and yet it produced exactly the right sound for Chris, this good-natured, somewhat vacant teenager who speaks with a specific weight and uncertainty that no other approach would have captured the same way. Green has talked about this origin story in interviews with a kind of bemused fondness, which makes sense, because the mental image of someone workshopping a Buffalo Bill impression to play a cartoon teenager is genuinely extraordinary. Patrick Warburton, who voices Joe Swanson, brings a quality to the character that is worth understanding in its own right. Warburton's natural speaking voice has an inherent authority and solidity to it, a quality that reads as physically substantial even without any visual accompaniment. Joe is a police officer in a wheelchair, and Warburton's voice communicates the specific contradiction of the character perfectly, someone whose physical presence in the world has been changed by injury, but whose identity and sense of self remain completely intact. In the early seasons, before the show started using Joe as a punchline for his disability rather than a character, Warburton's performance gave Joe a genuine dignity that made him one of the most compelling figures in the ensemble. The voice was doing work that the writing gradually stopped supporting. Mike Henry voiced Cleveland Brown, a role he held for many seasons before stepping away in 2020 and being replaced by Arif Zahir. Henry made that decision himself, publicly stating that a black character should be voiced by a black performer. This conversation, which has happened across the animation industry in recent years regarding characters of color being voiced by white actors, came to Family Guy in a moment of genuine self-examination by Henry. It is a decision that belongs to the history of who has spoken for these characters and why, and it marks the most significant casting change the show has undergone since Mila Kunis replaced Lacey Chabert in the second season. What emerges from all of these stories is a picture of a cast that was never quite inevitable, that could have been assembled completely differently at multiple points, and produced something recognizable in structure but unrecognizable in sound. The voices are the characters in a way that goes beyond simple performance. Take any of these performances away and replace them, and you do not have Family Guy with different casting. You have a different show entirely. Section 4. The episodes that Fox would not air a complete accounting. There are 2 episodes of Family Guy that Fox, the broadcast network that has aired the show since its 1999 premiere, refused to broadcast. 2 episodes written by the same writers, animated by the same studios, featuring the same cast, that were completed and ready, and then looked at by the people in charge of what goes on American network television, and quietly set aside. The reasons behind each refusal are different. The consequences for the show and its relationship with the network were different, and the fate of the 2 episodes after being blocked from broadcast was different. Together, they form a record of where the edge of the allowable actually was for a show that spent its entire existence testing where that edge was. The first episode to be pulled was When You Wish Upon a Weinstein, which was the 22nd episode of the 3rd season and was originally scheduled to air in 2000. The episode's plot centers on Peter Griffin, who is struggling with money management and becomes convinced, based on anti-Semitic stereotypes he holds about Jewish people being inherently skilled with finances, that what he needs is a Jewish person to help him sort out his financial problems. He finds and befriends a Jewish tax attorney named Max Weinstein, voiced by Ben Stein, and their friendship evolves in ways that ultimately satirize the very prejudice that drove Peter's initial thinking. The episode includes a musical number called I Need a Jew, which is built in the style of a Broadway show tune and parodies exactly the kind of casual bigotry the episode is examining. Fox's concern was straightforward to articulate and genuinely difficult to adjudicate. The episode's content was too easily read as itself anti-Semitic, rather than as a satire of anti-Semitism. The difference between a piece of media that mocks a prejudiced worldview and a piece of media that merely presents that worldview in an entertaining way is one of framing and intent, and it is a distinction that does not always survive contact with a broad audience. Fox believed that a significant portion of viewers would experience the episode as something that validated anti-Semitic thinking rather than interrogated it, and they declined to air it during Season 3. The episode did not disappear. It was included in the Family Guy Season 3 DVD set. It then aired on Adult Swim in 2003 as part of the show's incredibly successful run of reruns on Cartoon Network. And Fox eventually broadcast it in 2004, 4 years after it was originally scheduled. By that point, the show had been canceled and revived, and was returning for its 4th season as a genuine television event, and the episode was absorbed into the rerun rotation without causing the controversy Fox had originally feared. The I Need a Jew musical number generated its own secondary controversy years later when the sheet music for the song became the basis of a copyright infringement lawsuit. The publisher of When You Wish Upon a Star, the classic Disney song from Pinocchio, sued Fox on the grounds that the Family Guy parody infringed on their copyright. The lawsuit wound its way through the courts for several years before Fox ultimately prevailed. It was a legal contest over whether a parody could borrow too heavily from its source material, and the outcome established some precedent around how far parody can go before it crosses into infringement, which was a not insignificant result for a lawsuit that started with a cartoon dog singing about wanting a Jewish accountant. The second banned episode is in a completely different register. Partial Terms of Endearment was the final episode of Season 8, written by staff writer Danny Smith, and it deals with abortion. Not with abortion as a background issue or a casual reference, but as the central dramatic subject of the entire episode. Lois agrees to act as a surrogate mother for her college friend Naomi and Naomi's husband Dale. When both Naomi and Dale are killed in a car accident, Lois is left with a profound and unresolvable question. Does she carry the pregnancy to term and give the child up for adoption, or does she terminate the pregnancy? Peter, in the manner of the later season Peter we discussed earlier, gets swept up by anti-abortion protesters and becomes convinced that Lois must carry the pregnancy to term. Their competing positions drive the episode's conflict. The episode ends with Lois choosing to have an abortion, and the final joke involves Peter acknowledging what happened directly to camera. Fox announced the decision not to air partial terms of endearment at the San Diego Comic-Con in 2009, before the season had even begun airing. MacFarlane has said that he was surprised by the finality of the decision, having expected that Fox would eventually come around as they had with When You Wish Upon a Weinstein. That did not happen. Fox has never broadcast the episode in the United States. What distinguishes this case from the Weinstein situation is that even Cartoon Network's Adult Swim, which had run essentially everything the show had ever produced during the revival period, refused to air partial terms of endearment at Fox's request. The episode existed in a kind of broadcast exile that neither network was willing to break. The BBC in the United Kingdom aired the episode in June 2010 during the show's original Season 8 broadcast cycle, placing it in a primetime slot. It reached nearly 1 million homes on its first UK airing. The critical response was largely positive, with reviewers noting that the episode handled its subject with more care and balance than you would typically expect from Family Guy, and that the comedy, while present, was subordinate to a genuine engagement with the complexity of the situation. Mary Elizabeth Williams, writing in Salon, observed that the show's willingness to even address abortion as a subject matter made it more daring than most live-action television of the same era, and expressed pointed frustration that Fox would not broadcast an episode about a medical procedure that millions of American women had experienced. The episode was released on DVD in the United States in September 2010. It is available for digital purchase. MacFarlane, in DVD commentary for the episode, described it as the closest the show had come to doing a modern version of the kind of social issue episode that All in the Family used to do. That comparison is doing a lot of work, but it points toward what the writers believed they were attempting, not shock value, not provocation for its own sake, but a genuine piece of storytelling about a contested and personal subject delivered through the specific lens of the show. It remains the only Family Guy episode that has never aired on American television and appears to have no prospect of doing so. Beyond these two formal bannings, the show has had numerous episodes temporarily pulled from streaming platforms and removed from rotation following real-world events that made existing content suddenly inappropriate in ways nobody could have anticipated. The most dramatic of these was the Season 11 episode Turban Cowboy, which aired in March 2013 and depicted, among its various plot points, a cutaway gag showing Peter Griffin winning the Boston Marathon by driving his car through the crowd of runners. The episode also involved a terrorism plot in its main storyline. The Boston Marathon bombing happened on the 15th of April, 2013, about a month after the episode aired. What followed was one of the stranger media events of that period. An unknown person took the scene of Peter at the Boston Marathon and spliced it together with unrelated footage from the same episode of terrorist-related bomb detonations, creating a video that appeared to show Family Guy predicting or depicting the specific nature of the attack. This edited video spread rapidly, partly amplified by conspiracy theorist Alex Jones on his InfoWars platform, with accompanying claims that the show had somehow foreshadowed the bombing. MacFarlane took to social media immediately to call the edited clip abhorrent and to clarify that no such continuous scene existed in the actual episode. YouTube began removing uploads of the manipulated clip. Fox pulled the episode from its website and from Hulu and stated it had no immediate plans to air it again. The episode eventually returned to Hulu in September 2022, nearly a decade after it was pulled. It was not a formal reinstatement with any announcement. It simply reappeared in the catalog, available to stream, and the specific moment of its return attracted relatively little attention compared to the controversy of its removal. The passage of time had done what time usually does. All of these episodes and moments together form a kind of shadow archive of Family Guy, the version of the show that exists adjacent to the official broadcast record. Some of it was hidden deliberately. Some of it was pulled under pressure. Some of it was buried by circumstance. And some of it exists in forms that most people who consider themselves genuine fans of the show have never encountered. Section 5. The Osama bin Laden scene and the coincidence that changed everything. In May 2000, Family Guy aired an episode called Road to Rhode Island. It was the 13th episode of the second season, and it followed Brian Griffin and Stewie Griffin as they missed their flight home from Palm Springs and were forced to make their way across the country by whatever means became available, including stealing a car and hopping a freight train. Along the way, Brian discovered something genuinely painful about his past: the puppy mill in Texas, where he was born, and what had become of his mother. The episode was funny and then unexpectedly emotional and then funny again, and it represented the beginning of the Brian and Stewie road trip format that would become some of the most beloved entries in the show's history. The episode also contained a scene involving airport security and Osama bin Laden that no longer exists in most versions of Road to Rhode Island that you can watch today. The scene came at the airport, when Brian and Stewie were trying to board their flight home. Stewie approaches the security checkpoint with his carry-on luggage, which is of course full of weapons and grenades, because he is Stewie. Rather than attempt to hide this in any conventional way, Stewie breaks into a performance of the song On the Good Ship Lollipop, the Shirley Temple number, singing it with performative charm to distract the security staff from the X-ray scanner that would otherwise reveal the arsenal in his bag. After successfully making it through, Stewie mutters under his breath that he hopes Osama bin Laden does not know any show tunes. At which point the scene cuts to another security line, where Osama bin Laden is shown doing exactly what Stewie just did, singing from the song I Hope I Get It from a chorus line to distract the TSA agents from the weapons in his bag. When this scene aired in May 2000, Osama bin Laden was a known figure in American intelligence and foreign policy circles. Someone who had orchestrated bombings of U.S. embassies in Africa in 1998 and who was understood to represent a genuine threat. But he was not yet the dominant figure he would become. The name meant something to people who followed international news closely but did not carry the weight it would acquire 16 months later. The joke, which imagined a terrorist doing something absurd and theatrical in an airport, landed in the context of 2000 as dark but disconnected from lived reality. On the 11th of September 2001, Seth MacFarlane was supposed to be on a plane, American Airlines Flight 11, departing from Boston's Logan International Airport and bound for Los Angeles. MacFarlane had spent the previous evening at his alma mater, the Rhode Island School of Design, giving a speech and then celebrating with people he knew from his student years. He drank more than he intended to. His travel agent also made an error, giving him the wrong departure time for the flight, 8:15 in the morning rather than 7:45. Between the hangover and the schedule confusion, MacFarlane arrived at the Logan Airport gate with the doors already closed. He was 10 minutes too late. He booked a later flight and went to the airport lounge and fell asleep. He woke up approximately 45 minutes later to a commotion in the lounge. American Airlines Flight 11 had been hijacked and flown into the North Tower of the World Trade Center. He turned to the person next to him and said, "That was the flight I was supposed to be on. I was late. I missed it." His assistant, who had been told MacFarlane would be on a later flight but had not yet received confirmation that he had actually made it onto that later plane, spent a portion of the morning uncertain whether the creator of Family Guy had been killed in the attack. MacFarlane eventually made contact and the situation was clarified, but the emotional texture of those hours belongs to one of those extraordinary private stories that exist alongside public catastrophes. MacFarlane has spoken about the experience in measured terms over the years. He does not describe himself as someone whose entire perspective on life was transformed by the near miss. He has been candid that coincidences happen and that he was not inclined toward fatalism. But the experience sat with him, and the bizarre resonance between it and the Osama bin Laden joke that had aired on his show 16 months earlier was not lost on anyone. The decision to cut the bin Laden scene from Road to Rhode Island was made after September 11, and it was cut from essentially everything. Reruns did not include it. The standard US DVD release did not include it. Cartoon Network airings on Adult Swim did not include it. For years, the existence of the scene was documented by people who had seen the original broadcast and remembered it, but the scene itself was effectively unavailable. The Freakin' Sweet Collection, a special DVD release that came out in December 2004 specifically to provide uncensored and extended versions of episodes that fans had been asking about, included the full uncut version of Road to Rhode Island. That was where most fans eventually encountered the scene for the first time, in the context of a DVD collection whose explicit purpose was to restore things that had been taken away. The scene was eventually also restored to the Hulu streaming version from 2018 onward, and to certain international DVD releases that had operated under different editorial standards from the beginning. What makes this story resonate so deeply is the layering of coincidence within it. MacFarlane makes a show. His show makes a joke about a terrorist named Osama bin Laden using theatrical misdirection to smuggle weapons through an airport. The joke airs in May 2000. In September 2001, MacFarlane nearly dies in a terrorist attack executed by the same person his show made a joke about, and he survived because of a hangover and an administrative error. The scene that depicted a version of bin Laden was then removed from the episode, and all of this sits inside the history of a cartoon about a dysfunctional family in Rhode Island. Sometimes the context surrounding a piece of media is more extraordinary than the media itself. This is one of those cases. Section 6. The episode that proved Family Guy could do anything and what it cost. There are episodes of Family Guy that people remember because of a specific joke. There are episodes people remember because of a particular cutaway that got shared everywhere. And then there is Brian and Stewie, the 150th episode of the series, which aired in May 2010, and which people remember because it was completely unlike anything the show had ever attempted, and because it worked in ways that nobody fully predicted. The episode's concept is startlingly simple. Brian and Stewie go to a bank, and the vault door accidentally closes behind them. They are trapped inside the vault for the entire weekend, because banks are closed on Saturdays and Sundays, and they have no way of calling for help because Stewie wastes the last battery on his mobile phone on a call about a sweater. That is the entire setup. 2 characters, 1 room, no cutaway gags. No background music, no other characters, no plot B, no celebrity cameos, no random absurdist interruptions from the outside world. Just Brian and Stewie, alone with each other, for 30 minutes of television that the show had never tried to make before. The inspiration came from Seth MacFarlane and producer Cara Vallo's shared admiration for the episode Archie in the Cellar from the classic CBS sitcom All in the Family. In that episode, Archie Bunker is trapped alone in his basement with a bottle of vodka and has to exist with himself and his thoughts in a way the character was not accustomed to doing. The experience of watching 2 characters stripped of their usual context and forced to actually exist in each other's presence without the protective cushion of plot mechanics or external events produces a specific kind of emotional intimacy that does not arrive any other way. MacFarlane and writer Gary Janetti worked from a loose outline and a series of phone conversations about the structure and the emotional beats they wanted the episode to hit. The episode then became, in a production sense, the most unusual one the show had ever made. Because MacFarlane voices both Brian and Stewie, the entire thing was recorded as one man in a booth talking to himself for 30 minutes. J.D. Samuels, one of the show's writers, described the table read as essentially witnessing one person having an extended conversation with 2 different versions of himself, and said it was some of the most brilliantly written work she had encountered from MacFarlane in all her years working on the show. What the episode reveals about the characters, when they are put in a context where there is no way to avoid revealing things, is genuinely unexpected. Brian, who had kept a gun in his safe deposit box, eventually admits to Stewie that the gun was there for a very specific purpose. He had kept it for a long time, through seasons of the show, and its function was as insurance against a day when he decided that he could no longer find enough reason to keep living. He describes this to Stewie without melodrama, in the matter-of-fact way that Brian, at his best, communicates about the things that are most true about him. He says that life sometimes feels like too much, that he cannot find meaning, that the scotch in his box was meant to be a final drink. Stewie's response is not what you might expect. Rather than expressing horror or attempting to intervene in any formal sense, Stewie tells Brian something that arrives like a confession, that Brian is his only real friend, that without Brian, Stewie would be genuinely lost, that Brian's existence gives Stewie's life a purpose it would not otherwise have. The baby genius, who in Season 1 was plotting global domination and the murder of his own mother, is in this episode in Season 8 quietly telling his best friend that he loves him and that he needs him to stay. The character trajectory from the original Stewie to this Stewie is enormous, and the Brian and Stewie episode is the place where that trajectory is most nakedly visible. The Parents Television Council, The watchdog organization that had been complaining about Family Guy since the beginning immediately filed a complaint with the FCC about the episode, citing the scene where Brian consumes the contents of Stewie's soiled diaper as inappropriate for broadcast. The PTC's response to the episode's most emotionally raw moment, the suicide confession, was not a formal complaint but a note in their ongoing documentation of the show's offenses. The organization was more troubled by the scatological content than by the character revealing suicidal ideation, which says something interesting about what that organization considered dangerous. The episode ran approximately 27 minutes in its original broadcast, longer than a standard Family Guy episode, and was trimmed for reruns into something closer to the standard length. The extended version is the one most fans consider definitive because some of the emotional texture of the piece depends on its pace, on the willingness to let silence and discomfort occupy the space that cutaway gags would normally fill. When you take time away from it, you take something essential away from what the episode is doing. Brian and Stewie was celebrated by critics who had long been skeptical of the show's direction. It was cited as evidence that the people making Family Guy were capable of genuine ambition and execution when they chose to apply it. It was ranked very highly in fan polls about the best episodes the show had ever produced. And then, in the seasons that followed, the show largely returned to the format it had been operating in before Brian and Stewie, with cutaway gags and ensemble chaos and the broader, louder version of itself that dominated the later years. The episode stands as a kind of proof that the show had this capacity, this ability to do something restrained and emotionally honest and genuinely powerful, and that the decision not to do more of it was exactly that, a decision, not an inability, not a limitation of the format, a choice made about what kind of show Family Guy was going to be for most of its runtime, with Brian and Stewie existing as the exception that illuminates everything around it. Section 7. The characters behind the characters' real origins and hidden inspirations. The character of Peter Griffin did not spring fully formed from Seth MacFarlane's imagination. He evolved over years of observation, reference, and accident, and understanding where he actually came from says something interesting about the process of making something that feels original out of things that already exist in the world. The most documented origin of Peter's voice, as mentioned earlier in this script, is the security guard MacFarlane overheard at RISD. But the character's broader personality, the combination of working-class identity, physical impulsiveness, misplaced confidence, and underlying warmth, draws from a much older source. MacFarlane has cited Jackie Gleason's Ralph Cramden from The Honeymooners as a foundational reference for who Peter is at his core, a blustering, often wrong, fundamentally decent man who means well more consistently than he performs well. Ralph Cramden was doing this in the 1950s, a decade and a half before MacFarlane was born, and the DNA of that character architecture runs very clearly through early Peter Griffin. Brian Griffin is more obviously autobiographical, the failed writer who drinks a bit too much, who reaches for intellectual credibility while carrying the secret that his work does not yet justify the reach, who loves deeply but expresses it clumsily. This is a character assembled from the inside out, from the specific anxieties and aspirations of someone who knows that territory personally. MacFarlane has never made explicit claims about how much of Brian is self-portrait, but the specificity of the character's insecurities suggests intimate familiarity with them. Stewie's origins are more purely conceptual. MacFarlane was interested in the idea of a character who operated on a completely different cognitive plane from the world around them, who was aware of things that others were not aware of, and who could not communicate that awareness to the people closest to him. The particular form of that idea, a baby whose internal world is rich and sophisticated and menacing, while his external circumstances are entirely dependent and powerless, came from a desire to find the most extreme possible version of that disconnect. The British accent arrived as a way of underlining the sophistication, a signal that whatever is happening inside this character is operating in a register entirely separate from his family. The character of Quagmire, voiced by MacFarlane, was partly inspired by the lounge lizard archetype that was common in late-night entertainment in the 1950s and 1960s, a certain kind of performatively charming, relentlessly romantic male character whose confidence about his attractiveness to women was both his defining feature and his primary joke. MacFarlane modeled the voice on those figures, adding a specific nervous energy and vocal hiccup that became the character's signature. Meg Griffin's origins are among the most thematically interesting in the cast. She was conceived as the ordinary member of an extraordinary family, the one whose very normality was the joke. This is a classic comedic architecture, and it has appeared in many forms across television history. But what made Meg specific rather than generic was a genuine understanding of what it feels like to be the least interesting person in your own family, a feeling that is not comic at all in real life and becomes comic in the show only through exaggeration and distance. The irony of Meg's trajectory is that Mila Kunis, who has voiced the character since the second season, developed a genuine and protective affection for Meg that stands in direct contrast to what the writers were doing with the character for most of the middle seasons. Kunis has spoken about this repeatedly in interviews over the years, describing Meg as her favorite character on the show, describing her as all of us, meaning the person who wants to belong and is refused belonging, the person who deserves more than they receive. The disconnect between the actress's feeling about the character and the show's treatment of the character became one of the more poignant meta-narratives running alongside the show's official story. Joe Swanson was introduced in the first season's 7th episode, A Hero Sits Next Door, and his arrival was the result of the writers wanting to add a neighbor figure who would have a dynamic with Peter built on genuine contrast rather than simple foils. The wheelchair was decided on early as a character element, because Patrick Warburton's voice communicates a kind of physical authority and competence that the show wanted to complicate without diminishing. The result was a character who was physically limited and professionally formidable, whose disability was a biographical fact rather than a punchline in those early episodes, and whose friendship with Peter was grounded in a genuine mutual appreciation that the later seasons largely abandoned. Cleveland Brown's character was built on a different kind of contrast. Where Peter is loud and impulsive, Cleveland was calm and measured, the friend who responded to Peter's chaos with a kind of philosophical patience. The character was warm and grounded in ways that reflected Mike Henry's approach to the role, and his dynamic with the group at the Drunken Clam was a genuine element of the show's social world during its early seasons. The decision to spin Cleveland off into his own show, The Cleveland Show, which ran from 2009 to 2013, removed him from the Family Guy ensemble for much of that period, and the version of Cleveland who eventually returned was a somewhat different character from the one who had left. The naming conventions across the show also carry hidden information about their origins. The fictional town of Quahog, Rhode Island, is not purely invented. Quahog is a type of clam found in the waters off New England, and the name carries a specific regional identity that anchors the show in a real geography even as the town itself is fictional. Peter's surname, Griffin, has no documented specific inspiration but fits the working-class New England setting of the show. Lois's family name is Pewterschmidt, which communicates old money and social aspiration in ways that contrast directly with Peter's background. Brian having the surname Griffin rather than a dog-specific name is itself a joke that the show never explicitly makes. The acknowledgement that Brian is a full member of the family in every social and legal sense, not a pet who happens to be able to talk, but a person who happens to also be a dog. This distinction matters enormously to how Brian is written in the early seasons, when his dog nature is incidental to his character rather than central to it, and it is one of the things that gradually got less carefully maintained as the show went on. The character of Herbert, the elderly neighbor, voiced by Mike Henry, who displays an interest in young boys that the show plays for extremely dark comedy, is one of the more genuinely complicated recurring figures in the show's history. Herbert was conceived as a character who embodied something disturbing about a certain kind of neighborhood presence, an elderly man whose cheerfulness covers something much more troubling, and the comedy around him has always depended on the audience's awareness of exactly how troubled that something is. The character exists in a space that many critics have found deeply problematic and that the show has never fully grappled with in any explicit way, continuing to use Herbert for comedic purposes while declining to examine what exactly the show is doing by treating that subject matter as a source of laughs. The real-world people behind the characters who play versions of themselves in the show add another layer of complexity to the question of origins. Adam West, the actor who played Batman in the 1960s television series, voiced a fictionalized version of himself as the mayor of the fictional town for many years. and his participation gave the show access to a specific kind of gentle self-parody that West performed with evident enjoyment. West died in 2017, and his death was addressed in the show's 17th season with an episode that treated the passing of the mayor character as a genuine emotional event, which was one of the show's more sincere moments of grief in its later years. Section 8. Cutaways that were written but never animated the invisible history. Every episode of Family Guy that ever aired represents only a fraction of what was generated in the writing room during its production. The table read, where the entire writing staff sits together and the episode is performed aloud for the first time, is often significantly longer than the broadcast version. Some of what gets cut between table read and animation is cut for time. Some is cut because it does not land when performed aloud. Some is cut because the standards department flags it. And some is cut because Seth MacFarlane, or the showrunner, listens to it and decides that what seemed like a good idea in isolation does not work in the context of the episode around it. This invisible history is the hardest part of the show's archive to access, because much of it genuinely does not exist anywhere. Jokes that were pitched in the writer's room but never reached the page. Lines that were in early drafts but removed before the table read. Complete cutaway concepts that were written and then set aside during the editing process without ever reaching an animator. Some of this material surfaces in DVD commentary tracks and in interviews with writers who are willing to talk about what almost made it. The rest is simply gone. What has been documented, through commentary tracks and writer interviews and the occasional leaked table read, suggests that the gap between what the writing room generated and what the audience received was enormous, and that the material that was cut was not always the weakest material available. Sometimes a joke was cut because it was too similar to something the show had already done. Sometimes it was cut because it was too dark even by Family Guy standards. Sometimes it was cut simply because time ran out and someone had to make a choice about which jokes mattered more. The DVD commentaries for the early seasons are particularly rich in moments where the writers and actors describe things that were written and recorded but never made it to the final cut. MacFarlane, in commenting on various episodes from the first 3 seasons, has mentioned several cutaway concepts that he loved, but that were dropped for various reasons, some structural, some relating to rights issues around specific pop culture references, some simply because they were too long to include without cutting something else that was considered essential. The question of pop culture clearances is one of the major invisible forces shaping what Family Guy's cutaway gags actually contained. The show's format depends heavily on referencing, parodying, and recreating moments from film, television, music, and other cultural sources, and each of those references requires some form of clearance or legal determination about fair use. Some references that were written and intended for inclusion were cut because the clearance could not be obtained or because the cost of obtaining it was deemed excessive. Others were changed in ways that blunted the joke to make it fit within a cleaner legal framework. The show that aired was always operating within a set of constraints that were invisible to the audience but very visible to the people making it. One category of material that has been specifically discussed in interviews is the set of cutaways that were written to reference events from very recent news cycles. Jokes that depended on a specific current event being fresh in the audience's mind. These jokes were often written close to the episode's production deadline, inserted with the expectation that they would land because the event they referenced was actively in the news. Some of these worked. Some aged out of their context between writing and broadcast, particularly in cases where the news cycle moved faster than the animation pipeline, and were cut because the joke no longer made sense by the time the episode was ready to air. The animation pipeline is one of the most significant constraints on what Family Guy can do, and it is one that most viewers never think about. An episode that airs on a specific date was typically finished, in terms of animation, several months before that air date. The script was finalized months before that, and the initial pitch and writing process happened months before the script was finalized. This means that in total, the episode you watch in October might have been first conceived as a concept in February, written through the spring, animated through the summer, and finished in September. Anything topical that was written in February and referenced an event from that month is, by the time it airs, no longer topical at all. The show's team has developed strategies for managing this gap, including writing jokes that have a longer shelf life and avoiding references that are too narrowly tethered to a specific moment in time, but the gap is always there, shaping what can be said and when. There are also the scenes that were animated but cut in post-production, which exist in a more tangible form than the purely conceptual material that was discussed and discarded. These appear occasionally in the deleted scenes sections of DVD releases and in animatics that the show sometimes makes available as bonus content. Watching an animatic, which is the rough animated version of a scene produced during the early stages of animation before the detailed work is done, gives you a sense of what an episode might have been before the editing decisions that shaped it into its final form. The timing is different. The pacing breathes differently. Jokes that were cut often appear in animatic form, and you can evaluate for yourself whether the decision to remove them was the right one. One episode whose cuts are unusually well documented is the Season 7 episode, The Splendid Source, in which Chris gets suspended from school for telling a dirty joke, and Peter's investigation into the origin of that joke leads him to an island populated by the world's funniest people. The original broadcast episode ends before the audience ever hears the joke that started the whole investigation. That ending was a deliberate creative choice, a joke about the premise of the joke, but the DVD version of the episode includes an extended ending in which the joke is actually told at considerable length and with a great deal of profanity. The joke itself is the kind of humor that exists at the outer edge of what is broadly shareable, which is presumably why the decision was made to remove it from the broadcast version while preserving it for the DVD audience, who had specifically chosen to seek out the uncensored content. The extended ending changes the episode in fundamental ways. The broadcast version's ending, where the audience is denied the joke that was promised, is funnier and more conceptually satisfying as a piece of comedy. The DVD ending, where you actually hear the joke, is more explicit and more gratuitously offensive, but delivers a different kind of payoff. The episode works differently depending on which version you watch, which is not usually the case for deleted material, and it serves as an example of how cuts are not always about compliance. Sometimes they are genuine artistic decisions about what makes a piece of work function better. Section 9. The network battles what happened behind the closed doors at Fox. The relationship between Seth MacFarlane and Fox was one of the most interesting, creative, and institutional partnerships in the history of American television, and it was also, for significant stretches of its duration, a relationship defined by genuine tension. Understanding that tension requires understanding the specific institutional environment that Fox Broadcasting Company represented during the years when Family Guy was on the air, and what it meant for someone with MacFarlane's specific politics and aesthetic sensibilities to be making his most important work on that particular platform. Fox, the broadcasting network, and Fox News, the cable news channel, have always been legally and organizationally distinct entities, connected through their shared parent company structure but operating independently of each other. However, the association in the public mind between the two was and remains strong, and for MacFarlane, who has been openly and consistently politically liberal throughout his career, the association was one he found increasingly uncomfortable as the years went on. The first major institutional conflict between MacFarlane and Fox was the scheduling chaos of the early seasons, which has been mentioned in earlier sections of this script. Fox moved the show around between time slots without adequate notice, competing against established programming in ways that made it impossible for the show to build a stable audience. MacFarlane has been clear in various interviews over the years that he believes Fox's handling of the show during its first 3 seasons was a significant factor in the cancellation, and that a more thoughtful scheduling approach might have allowed the show to build the audience it needed to survive without the cancellation and revival that became necessary. The network's behavior during the 2007 Writers Guild of America strike was the second major point of friction. MacFarlane was a supporter of the strike and was visible on the picket lines. The dispute concerned writers' compensation from DVD sales and digital distribution, a fight that the WGA was waging on behalf of the people who actually generated the creative content that the studios were profiting from. When the strike began, production on Family Guy stopped. But Fox, which legally owned the episodes that had already been completed before the strike, exercised their right to air 3 of those completed episodes while the strike was ongoing, without MacFarlane's consent or approval. The episodes aired. There was nothing MacFarlane could legally do to prevent it, but the decision left a mark on the relationship. MacFarlane has on various occasions described his association with Fox using language that suggests he saw himself as something of a compromised figure there, someone whose work was genuinely good and whose audience genuinely valued it, but who was also lending credibility to an institutional structure he found troubling. In 2021, he posted publicly about Fox News host Tucker Carlson in terms that made his discomfort explicit, saying that the commentary on that channel made him wish Family Guy was airing on any other network. He compared the situation to a failing marriage where both parties understand the relationship is not working but continue in it because of the structural commitments that hold them there. The 2020 deal with NBC Universal, worth a reported $200 million over 5 years, moved MacFarlane's production company Fuzzy Door Productions into a different institutional home. His new projects, including the science fiction series The Orville, were being made for Hulu and streaming platforms with no connection to Fox. Family Guy remained on Fox because the contracts required it to. But the creator of Family Guy was no longer building his future there. This is a genuinely unusual situation in the history of long-running television. The person whose name and voice and creative identity are inseparable from a show is simultaneously the person most vocally uncomfortable with the network airing that show. And yet the show continues. The episodes are made, the voices are recorded, the animation goes through its pipeline, and the episodes arrive on schedules that are now Wednesday nights rather than the Sunday slots the show occupied for most of its history. There were also more granular battles over specific content decisions that happened over the years between the show's writers and Fox's Standards and Practices Department. These disputes were rarely publicized in detail, but the evidence of them exists in the DVD commentary tracks and writer interviews that document moments where a scene was altered or removed following network feedback. MacFarlane, in commentary for various episodes, has described specific interactions with Standards and Practices in terms that range from amused to frustrated, suggesting a relationship where the show's team pushed hard and the network pushed back, and the final product represented a negotiated position somewhere between the two. The show also navigated the complicated terrain of what real people and real companies could be depicted in what ways. Family Guy has referenced, parodied, and sometimes outright impersonated real public figures throughout its history, and the legal and clearance work required to manage that is substantial. Some references that appeared in scripts were altered before animation because the legal team identified exposure. Some were altered after animation during the editing process. Some were included despite legal uncertainty and then defended when challenged. The show's willingness to engage with real figures in sometimes very unflattering ways was always a source of institutional anxiety at Fox, which had its own relationships with the people and companies being depicted. James Woods, who has been a recurring character on the show for many seasons, appeared in the show as a fictionalized villainous version of himself beginning in the 3rd season. Woods has spoken about this over the years with what appears to be genuine appreciation for the joke, describing himself as understanding that the character is a parody and being willing to lean into it. He even came back to voice the character multiple times. But the show's use of his likeness in increasingly unflattering ways represents a kind of ongoing experiment in what a real person will consent to when the context is clearly comedic. One of the most discussed institutional battles in the show's history is one that the show itself made explicit: the PTV episode from Season 4. This episode, which was a direct response to the post-Super Bowl censorship environment of 2004, depicted Peter Griffin starting his own uncensored broadcast network and then being subjected to government crackdown. The FCC characters in the episode were depicted in broadly unflattering ways. The episode's final act included a musical number that made arguments about artistic freedom in terms that were fairly explicit about the show's own position on its ongoing relationship with regulatory oversight. The irony of this episode being itself subjected to cuts before broadcast became a talking point that the show's writers were quite aware of and openly sardonic about. Section 10. The animation studio's Nobody Talks About the Hands That Drew It All. The characters of Family Guy are immediately recognizable to hundreds of millions of people around the world. The thick black outlines, the specific way Peter moves, the exact shade of Lois's auburn hair, the geometry of Stewie's football-shaped head. These are visual facts so thoroughly absorbed into popular culture that they feel almost as inevitable as the characters themselves. But those visual facts were never entirely stable, and understanding why requires looking at something that most Family Guy conversations never address: the animation studios that actually produced the show, and what changed every time a different studio was doing the work. Animation production for American television is almost never done entirely in the country where the show airs. The economics of animation at scale require access to labor markets, where the work of drawing thousands of frames of movement can be done at a cost that makes the whole enterprise financially viable. Family Guy has been produced through a series of overseas animation partnerships throughout its history, and each partnership brought its own specific aesthetic qualities to the work, producing variations in look and feel that attentive fans can identify if they know what to look for. The original pilot episode was animated by Film Roman and Sunwoo Digital International through its animation division Grimsame Animation Co. Film Roman was one of the major American animation studios of that era, responsible for the long-running run of The Simpsons and various other projects. Sunwoo, the Korean animation studio handling the actual frame-by-frame work, produced animation that had a specific texture to it, looser, somewhat rougher around the edges, but also more expressive and alive in the way that early things often are. The characters in the first season move with a particular energy that the show would never quite recapture once the animation pipeline became more standardized. Seasons 2 and 3 were animated by Rough Draft Studios, a Korean-American company that had also done extensive work for The Simpsons and Futurama. The Rough Draft era is widely considered the visual peak of Family Guy by fans who pay attention to animation quality, and the specific qualities that make those seasons look right have been discussed extensively in fan communities. The outlines feel more natural. The movement has a fluidity that comes from animators who understood the characters and their physical vocabulary deeply. When Stewie raises an eyebrow or Brian does a take after something goes wrong, in the Rough Draft seasons, those reactions land with a precision that reflects animators working at a very high level. When the show returned from cancellation for Season 4 in 2005, the animation looked different in ways that McFarlane and various production team members acknowledged in commentary and interviews. The outlines were thicker. The movement was stiffer. The characters still looked like the characters, but they moved differently, and that difference affected how jokes landed. Physical comedy in particular is sensitive to animation quality in ways that are hard to articulate but immediately felt. A fall or a collision or a reaction that should be funny needs to be timed correctly in the movement. And when the timing is slightly off or the movement is slightly stiff, the joke loses some of its force even if the underlying concept is strong. Seasons 6 and 7 brought further changes, with Digital Emation and Yedim handling portions of the work. Digital Emation's animation was competent but had a flatness that fans noted, particularly in the way faces and expressions were rendered. The characters were recognizable, but the expressiveness that had defined the earlier seasons was diminished. The eyes moved differently. The mouths moved differently. The show still worked, but it looked like a show being produced efficiently rather than a show being produced with the same level of animation-specific care that had defined its earliest seasons. This matters more than it might initially seem, because animation is not separate from comedy. The physical performance of animated characters is the equivalent of a live actor's embodied presence, and the quality of that performance determines whether the visual humor of a scene lands the way it was intended to. Family Guy is a show where a significant portion of the comedy is physical, where the way a character moves or reacts in the moment of a joke is part of what makes the joke work. Degraded animation quality is not just an aesthetic concern, it is a comedic concern. The animators who worked on the earliest seasons of the show understood the characters in their hands in a way that later animators, working from style guides and model sheets rather than from the same early and intimate familiarity, could not fully replicate. This is not a failure of the later animators. It is the natural consequence of the way animation production works, and the way creative institutional memory lives in specific people who cannot always be retained across many years and multiple studio changes. There is also the question of what digital tools did to the animation as the show moved through its history. The transition from traditional animation approaches to entirely digital production methods happened across the animation industry during the period when Family Guy was on the air, and the specific qualities that digital production brings, cleaner lines, more consistent spacing, easier editing and revision, also bring things away. The slightly unpredictable quality of hand-drawn work, the places where a line wavers slightly or a movement has an organic imprecision, disappeared in the digital era, and with it went some of the vitality that the early seasons had. The animation of the show as it exists today in its current seasons, is technically proficient in ways that could not have been achieved with the tools available in 1999. But technical proficiency is not the same as artistic vitality, and the gap between what the show can do now and what it chose to do in those first 3 seasons is visible in every episode if you know where to look. Section 11. The moments that made it to air against all odds. Some of the most memorable moments in Family Guy's history almost did not happen. They were challenged during production, flagged by standards departments, questioned in table reads, or simply considered too risky by someone with institutional authority over what went on television. The fact that they made it through the process and arrived in living rooms around the world is in many cases a story of creative stubbornness, of writers and producers who believed in a piece of material enough to fight for it through multiple rounds of pushback. The episode Stewie Kills Lois and its follow-up Lois Kills Stewie, the 2-part 6th season storyline where Stewie finally achieves his long-stated goal of killing his mother, is one of the more extraordinary examples of the show committing to a premise that had significant institutional risk. The idea of actually depicting the death of a main character, even in a narrative that eventually revealed itself to be a simulation, required Fox to sign off on a story direction that the network was understandably cautious about. Characters do not die on network animated comedies, or they did not at that point. The potential for audience distress was real. The potential for backlash if the story was handled poorly was real. What made the episodes work, and what presumably allowed them to get through the development process, was the quality of the execution. The writers committed fully to the premise, treating Stewie's successful elimination of Lois as a dramatic event rather than a comedic one, and allowing the weight of what had supposedly happened to shape the episode that followed it. When Lois returned in the second part and the confrontation between the two characters escalated into something genuinely operatic, it was clear that the show was doing something after years that it built toward for 5 seasons. The eventual revelation that the entire storyline was a computer simulation on Stewie's laptop, a reset that returned everything to the status quo, was both a narrative cheat and a structurally honest move, given that the show was not in a position to permanently alter its central character dynamics. The episode Brian and Stewie, discussed at length earlier in this script, is another example. The premise of a bottle episode with no cutaways and no music and only 2 characters was not obviously compatible with what Family Guy's audience expected from the show, and there was genuine uncertainty in the production process about whether the approach would be accepted. When producer Caravallo describes MacFarlane's decision to make an episode that did not rely on the show's standard techniques, she frames it as a deliberate creative risk, the kind of decision that requires someone with creative authority to simply choose to do it and then stand behind that choice when others are uncertain. The episode The Road to the Multiverse from Season 8, which featured Brian and Stewie traveling through parallel versions of reality in which Family Guy was drawn in the style of various other animated shows, was another technically ambitious episode that required a significant investment in production beyond the normal budget. The segment, done in the style of a Disney animated feature, required animators to work in a completely different visual register from the show's standard approach, with watercolor backgrounds and fluid movement that bears no resemblance to the typical Family Guy aesthetic. That material cost more to produce and required specific expertise that was not part of the show's normal production pipeline. It made it onto the air because someone decided it was worth the additional investment, and audiences responded to it with considerable enthusiasm. The episode in which Meg finally confronts her family about how they have treated her, Seahorse Seashell Party from Season 10, contains what is, in retrospect, one of the most pointed pieces of genuine social commentary in the show's history, wrapped inside a hurricane episode, and followed by a plot resolution that undermined everything the confrontation had accomplished. But the confrontation itself, the speech Meg delivers about each member of her family and the specific things they have done to her, made it to air in its full form, including the most uncomfortable details about Peter's behavior. The fact that the writers allowed Meg to name those things explicitly, to put on the record what had been happening to her, and then had her take it all back, has been analyzed by fans and critics in ways that the show's writers clearly did not fully anticipate. One category of moments that made it through against all odds is the category of emotionally genuine moments in a show that was largely hostile to emotional sincerity. These include Brian's speech to his dying son Dylan in the episode Brian's Got a Brand New Bag, which contains a note of real parental feeling that is unusual in the context of later Family Guy. They include the episode where Meg and Peter reconcile after the revelation of Peter's abusive history with his sister. They include various road to episodes where the friendship between Brian and Stewie is rendered with a tenderness that the show's broader tone does not typically accommodate. These moments made it to air not despite the show's cynicism, but in a kind of productive tension with it. They arrived as exceptions that proved something the show was not usually willing to prove, that it had access to genuine feeling when it chose to use it, that the characters had accumulated enough history by the later seasons that emotional weight was available to them whether the show chose to use it or not. The moments that made it through against all odds are the moments that remind you why people stayed with the show long past the point where they had significant reservations about its direction. Section 12. The Simpsons crossover and what it revealed about both shows. In 2014, Family Guy aired an episode called The Simpsons Guy, in which the Griffin family drove away from a controversy in Dillon to escape public anger and ended up through a series of random events in Springfield. The episode was the longest in Family Guy's history at the time, running nearly an hour, and it featured extensive crossover between the characters of both shows with the full participation of the Simpsons cast. The episode is one of the more self-aware things either show has ever produced, a piece of television that spent a substantial portion of its runtime making explicit the rivalry and the comparison between the two animated families that had dominated American primetime comedy for a generation. Stewie bonded with Bart. Brian and Santa's little helper established a dog friendship. Peter and Homer discovered their fundamental compatibility as overweight, beer-drinking fathers who loved their families imperfectly. Meg, in one of the episode's most celebrated moments, met Lisa Simpson, who encouraged her and helped her discover a talent for the saxophone. But the episode's central conflict was between Peter and Homer over which of their cities had the better chicken or stew dish, a dispute that escalated into a legal confrontation and ultimately into a fight between the two characters that was extended far beyond what any narrative logic required, deliberately so, in a nod to the long-running chicken fight sequences that Family Guy had made famous. This extended conflict was the episode's way of addressing the comparison between the shows directly without resolving it, because resolving it would have required one show to admit the other was better, and neither show was in a position to do that. What the crossover revealed about Family Guy specifically is something about how the show understood its own place in the cultural conversation. Family Guy had spent its entire existence in The Simpsons' shadow in terms of critical legacy and cultural prestige, even while regularly beating The Simpsons in contemporary ratings and maintaining a more current internet presence through the viral nature of its cutaway gags. The anxiety about this comparison was always latent in the show's identity, and the crossover episode was the first time that anxiety was addressed directly rather than sublimated. The episode also revealed something about Meg that most episodes refused to acknowledge, that she was capable of genuine depth and connection when the show chose to write her that way. The Lisa and Meg storyline is genuinely moving in a way that the show rarely attempted with Meg, and the sight of Mila Kunis's voice giving Meg an emotional range that the usual treatment of the character denied her is a reminder of what was consistently sacrificed in exchange for whatever the show thought it was getting from the abuse narrative. The Simpsons side of the equation was handled with care and a genuine affection for the Springfield characters that came through in how they were written. Homer was clearly Homer. Marge was clearly Marge. The Springfield aesthetic was replicated with enough fidelity that it functioned as a genuine tribute rather than a parody. MacFarlane's team clearly loved The Simpsons enough to represent it honestly, even in the context of a story that was partly about the tension between the two franchises. The episode attracted 20 million viewers, its highest audience in years, a number driven by the novelty of seeing two of the most recognizable animated casts in television history share a screen for the first time. It was an event television moment of the kind that had become increasingly rare for Family Guy, and it demonstrated that the show's cultural footprint remained enormous, even as its regular weekly audience had declined significantly from its revival-era peaks. Section 13. The writers who shaped it, names most people don't know. The names that most people associate with Family Guy are Seth MacFarlane, the cast, and perhaps in later years the showrunners who succeeded MacFarlane in day-to-day creative leadership. But the specific character of each season of the show, The particular jokes and story directions that distinguish one era from another are the product of a large and constantly evolving writing staff whose individual contributions are rarely acknowledged in the popular conversation about the show. Some of the original writers who helped establish the show's identity in its first 3 seasons include Chris Sheridan, Danny Smith, Gary Janetti, and Neil Goldman, and Garrett Donovan, who often wrote together. These writers helped build the comedic infrastructure of the show during the period when it was figuring out what it was, and their influence is visible in the specific texture of the early seasons, the way jokes were constructed, the way character moments were integrated into storylines, the particular balance between sentiment and irreverence that made the show work at its best. Danny Smith has remained with the show for its entire run, from the first season through the current production. He is one of the most tenured writers in the show's history, and his long presence means he carries more institutional memory of the show's development than almost anyone else. He also voiced the character of Ernie the Giant Chicken, the recurring adversary whose periodic appearances in extended fight sequences with Peter became one of the show's signature recurring bits. The first such fight, in the episode Da Boom, was directed by an animator who had considerable latitude to develop the sequence in ways that went beyond what was on the page, and the result was a physically spectacular piece of animation that established a template the show has returned to many times. Gary Janetti wrote Road to Rhode Island, the episode considered by many, including MacFarlane, to be among the best the show ever produced, and continued to contribute to the show's road to episodes over many years. He later wrote Brian and Stewie, the bottle episode already discussed extensively in this script, working from MacFarlane's loose structure and phone conversations to create something that many fans consider the show's artistic peak. Janetti's work on the show has a particular quality of emotional intelligence operating underneath the surface humor that distinguishes it from the broader bulk of episodes in the later seasons. Alex Sulkin and Rich Appel became the primary showrunners after MacFarlane stepped back from day-to-day creative leadership around 2011. Both had been with the show for years before taking on the showrunner role, meaning they were not coming in from outside as hired managers, but as longtime creative contributors who had been shaped by the show's existing culture. The decisions made during their tenure, including the directions taken with the characters and the increased reliance on shock value, reflect their specific sensibilities and their interpretation of what the show should be in MacFarlane's reduced presence. The question of how much the writing room's composition changes the character of a show is one that does not have a simple answer, but Family Guy provides a reasonably clear case study. The original writing room produced a show with specific qualities. As that room changed, those qualities changed with it, not because the new writers were less talented, but because they brought different sensibilities and different creative instincts to the same institutional structure. The show that exists today and the show of the early seasons share characters and setting and format, but reflect the accumulated creative decisions of a writing staff that has turned over substantially multiple times since 1999. The addition of more women to the writing staff in the show's later seasons has been credited, including in public statements from various people involved with the show, with contributing to a reduction in the most extreme elements of Meg's mistreatment. The specific voices present in a writer's room shape what gets written, and the absence of women in the writing room during the period when the Meg abuse was at its most intense is not a coincidence. It is a causal relationship, and acknowledging that is part of understanding how television gets made and who bears the consequences when certain perspectives are absent from the rooms where stories are decided. Section 14. The stories that changed continuity, resets, and the show's refusal to grow. One of the most consistent frustrations that fans and critics have expressed about Family Guy over its long run is the show's relationship with continuity, or rather, its lack of one. Events that seem significant, deaths, revelations, character decisions, moments of genuine emotional consequence, have a tendency to simply not carry forward into the episodes that follow them. The reset button, as this practice is often called, means that the audience can invest in a storyline's emotional stakes and then watch those stakes dissolve when the following episode begins, as though nothing happened. The most dramatic and widely discussed example of this was Brian Griffin's death in the season 12 episode Life of Brian in November 2013. Brian was hit by a car in the episode's final act and died on the pavement while the Griffin family gathered around him. The show treated it as a serious, dramatic moment, Stewie was devastated. A replacement dog named Vinny, voiced by Tony Sirico, was introduced in the episode immediately following Brian's death. Fans were genuinely distraught. The hashtag about Brian's death trended on social media. Media coverage of the decision was extensive. 2 episodes later, in the Christmas episode Christmas Guy, Stewie used a time travel device acquired from a future version of himself to go back in time and prevent Brian from being hit by the car. Brian did not die. Everything that had happened as a consequence of Brian's death was undone. Vinny remained as a briefly existing character but was quietly phased out, and everything returned to exactly the state it had been before Brian died. The whole arc, from the emotional devastation of the death to the relief of the revival, had taken approximately 1 month of broadcast time. The response to Brian's resurrection was more complex than the response to his death. Many fans who had been genuinely upset by the death were now upset that the death had been meaningless. Critics who had noted the genuine emotional impact of the death episode noted that the almost immediate reversal undercut that impact and suggested that the decision to kill Brian had been made not for creative reasons but for the temporary ratings and attention boost that a character death would generate. MacFarlane, in subsequent interviews, has been somewhat indirect about the decision-making process behind both the death and the revival, but the timeline suggests that the revival was planned from the beginning, which makes the death itself a more calculated gesture than it initially appeared. The pattern of significant events being reversed extends beyond Brian's death. The Stewie Kills Lois two-parter, discussed earlier, ends with the revelation that the entire storyline was a computer simulation. Various relationship developments between characters have been established and then quietly abandoned. Peter has learned lessons at the end of episodes and forgotten them completely by the following week. Meg and Peter have reconciled meaningfully multiple times, and each reconciliation has been followed by a return to the standard dynamic as though it never happened. This refusal to let things stick is different from the episodic format that many sitcoms use, where each episode is largely self-contained and character development is limited. Most sitcoms simply do not generate events that seem significant enough to require continuity. Family Guy has repeatedly generated those events, moments of genuine weight and consequence, and then treated them as though they had not happened. The show seems to want both the emotional impact of significant events and the freedom that comes from ignoring those events, and it has not found a way to reconcile those two desires. The moments that the show has allowed to stick are worth noting because they suggest that continuity is possible within the format when the creative team chooses to maintain it. Cleveland's departure from the main cast, followed by his eventual return, was handled with a degree of narrative consistency. The evolution of the Brian and Stewie friendship across many seasons carries genuine cumulative weight, with callbacks and references to past episodes that suggest a real history between the characters. The Peter and Lois relationship, for all its turbulence, has maintained a basic structural consistency over the show's run. What the show never figured out was how to let its main characters actually change over time in ways that made the audience's long-term investment feel rewarded. The characters who emerged at the end of 20-plus seasons are recognizably the same characters who appeared at the beginning in terms of their basic personalities and relationships, but the texture of those personalities had shifted in ways that the show never fully acknowledged or examined. Peter became crueler without the show treating that cruelty as a character development. Brian became more pretentious without the show, presenting that as a trajectory the character was on. Stewie became gentler without the show mourning what had been lost. The audience that grew up with the show was watching characters change in real time without the show giving them a framework for understanding or processing those changes. The result was a kind of background dissatisfaction that accumulated over many years, the feeling that something had been lost without quite being able to name what it was or when it had gone. Section 15. What remains the legacy of the unseen and the unfinished? We have spent a great deal of this night moving through the shadows of Family Guy's history, the things that were cut, and the things that were hidden, and the things that almost happened, and the things that happened without anyone fully understanding their consequences. What we have found in those shadows is not a neat story with a clear arc. It is something more interesting and more honest than that. A record of people trying very hard to make something good, sometimes succeeding beyond anyone's expectations, sometimes failing in ways that were entirely predictable, and producing over the course of more than 25 years a body of work that contains more complexity and more contradiction and more genuine feeling than its reputation always allows for. The pilot that Seth MacFarlane drew in his kitchen in 1998 was the beginning of something he could not have fully predicted. He knew the characters, he knew their voices, he knew the general shape of the world he was building. But the specific ways in which that world would expand and contract and transform over the years that followed were not foreseeable in any meaningful sense. The show became things he intended and things he did not intend. It was shaped by his choices and by the choices of writers and animators and executives and events in the outside world that nobody could have planned for. The 22 million people who watched the first episode after the Super Bowl in 1999 were seeing something that felt genuinely new. The fewer than 1 million who are watching the most recent seasons before the 2025 renewal deal are watching something that has become familiar in ways that can feel comforting or exhausting depending on your relationship with it. Neither of those numbers fully captures what the show is, because the show is not any single moment of its viewership history. It is the accumulated weight of everything that happened between that first broadcast night and wherever it stands today. What remains of the material that was cut and censored and hidden and altered is scattered across multiple formats and platforms. Some of it is on DVD releases that are increasingly hard to find in an era when streaming has largely replaced physical media. Some of it is in commentary tracks that are preserved in those same releases, voices talking over old episodes about what they were trying to do and what they would do differently. Some of it is in interviews and oral histories that are indexed in various places online. And some of it is simply gone, existing only in the memories of the people who were in the room when it was created. The pitch pilot, now available after being lost for 27 years, is the clearest example of material that was nearly permanently inaccessible becoming, through chance and the decisions of individuals who chose to share what they had, something that the broader audience could finally see. It is a reminder that the archive of a show like this is fragile, that the things which were not officially preserved are always at risk of disappearing entirely, and that the people who happen to have copies of things on old hard drives or in physical archives are the custodians of a history that belongs to the culture more broadly. The show continues. As of the time of writing this script, Family Guy has been renewed through its 27th season, secured in a deal with Disney that will take it to the 2028 to 2029 television season, coinciding with the show's 30th anniversary. 15 episodes per season. MacFarlane will continue to voice the characters. The animation pipeline will continue to deliver episodes on a schedule. The show will reach its 30th year as a production entity, which is an achievement that almost no animated television series has managed. What those years will contain, and what will be cut from them before they reach the audience, and what secrets about their production will eventually surface, and which moments will be the ones that people are still talking about a generation from now, none of that is knowable from here. What is knowable is that the history we have been moving through tonight is not over. There are more unseen moments being created right now in writing rooms and recording booths and animation studios, more decisions being made about what to include and what to leave out, more negotiations between what the people making the show want to say and what the institutions around them will allow. That negotiation never ends, and the gap between what a creative work wanted to be and what it actually became, when you can find it, is always one of the most honest things about any piece of art. The show began with one exhausted man drawing alone. It is still going, and somewhere in the distance between those two facts is the whole complicated, funny, sometimes brilliant, sometimes frustrating, genuinely historic story of Family Guy, including all the parts that nobody was supposed to see. If you made it this far, thank you. Genuinely. This is the kind of deep archival journey that takes a long time to put together, and it means everything that you stayed with it. If you are listening to this right now, and you have not already subscribed to the channel, please do that now. It keeps us going and allows us to keep making content like this. Leave a comment and let me know what section surprised you the most, or what you knew about and what you had never heard before. And if there is a show or a topic you want to see covered in this format, drop it in the comments. We read every single one. Sleep well. We will be back soon.